didn't even have weapons to train with, so they had to make their own out of wood. And the small allowance that the Polish army was given of food wasn't, they gave none to the civilians, so the Polish soldiers used to split their food to share with the civilians. But gradually they started to develop, but the significant thing was, of all those turning up to enlist, there was no officers. But as I say, he started to develop and move forward, and Anders refused to send them to the front. He wouldn't send them because he wasn't fully trained, he didn't want them to be cattle fodder, and because the history of Poland and Russia was never good, so he just wasn't having his men lost for no end, and refused to send them to the front. The following spring, in February 1942, they moved. It was quite cold up here, so they moved further down to the Uzbek region around Tashkent, where the army actually expanded into more divisions. There were so many people turning up, but this caused even more problems really, because the weather conditions and the food wasn't right, and there was lots of illnesses. And even by this time, this is February 1942, my dad still hadn't been released. He actually got his release on the 17th of February 1942, and this is his original release document. What you can see here is the NKV, the Soviet NKVD. It's on the Northern Region administration camps. This is a very early picture of my dad. This is his name in Cyrillic, Pleszak, Nikolai, my dad's name, Vinchenchevich. He was born in 1920 in Shvaksty, and he was given this release document, which was also a travel warrant that allowed him to travel to a place called Akhmelinsk in Kazakhstan. Akhmelinsk is now known as a stan, actually, in Kazakhstan. But he never got there because he tried to find the Polish army in Tashkent, which he did. But even though he was released in February of 1942, he didn't immediately get away. And this is a famous photograph from a book. This guy is called Anatol Krokievsky, and he was a famous poet and author. And after the war, he wrote a book about his time in Kolyma. And this guy is called, what's his name? Lucian Aksnovich. And once they'd been released from the Gulag, they congregated in Magadan, where they were given little jobs and better clothing and a bit better food. And they waited for an opportunity to get back from Magadan back to Vladivostok in order to find the Polish army. And with a little bit of money he was given, he actually bought a camera. And this picture was taken in the cemetery in Magadan at a time when he was waiting to get back. And I spoke to his son, and he said, if you find this book, have a look at the photograph in it because your dad's in it. And I got it and I couldn't believe it. And when I looked through it, I actually found my dad there. That's my dad. Unbelievable. So this went all through the summer. He didn't actually get away until June, and apparently he had to bribe the little bit of money he had to a boat to get him back to Vladivostok, but at least he was on his way. As I say, down in Uzbekistan, the army expanded. There was lots of soldiers turning up, and Anders persistently refused to let the Polish army go and fight on the Russian front. And at this time, Stalingrad was at its highest ebb, and Stalin decided he would release some of the Poles from the Soviet Union. They were allowed to go to what was then known as Persia, Iran as we now know it, where they could release Russian soldiers that were guarding the oil fields with the British here. So in two exoduses from the Soviet Union, there was one in the April of 1942 and one in the August, where he allowed these groups of people to sail from the port of what was then known as Krasnovodsk. It's actually now known as Turkmenbasit in Turkmenistan, and they sailed across the Caspian Sea to Persia, to a place called Parlevi, or Anzali as it is now, where they would come under the control of the British Army, who were in Iran at that time. The Polish government in exile chartered some totally unsuitable ships. They were coal barges, oil tankers, anything that they could get groups of people on. And eventually they got 78,000 soldiers out of the Soviet Union and 38,000 civilians. So around 115,000 people managed to get out of Russia before Stalin said, right, that's enough, I'm having no more of this. And my dad eventually got out on the 25th of August on a ship called Zhdanov, and it was just 5 days before the very last ship. So again, I'm so lucky that my dad was able to do that. Once in Iran, they had better food, and it was the first proper food and hospitality they'd had since, some of them, since the very first days of August 1939. The people that I've spoken to that went through this really speak highly of the people of Iran for what they did for them at this time. But having said that, their stomachs weren't they just weren't used to this type of food, so there was dysentery problems and terrible stomach problems, and Stalin refuses any more of the Poles to leave. Of those that got out, of that 115,000, the civilians went to various refugee camps around the world, notably in East and South Africa, some to Mexico, some to Australia and New Zealand, and famously a group of about 5,000 orphan children were taken in by Maharaja in Bombay, and they lived till the end of the war in Valivaldi and Balchadi. Quite a nice story there about those. But the army, those 30,000 of the army, almost immediately left Pahlavi in Iran to go to their training area in the central region of Iraq. There they were going to do the training and also help protect the oil fields with the British that were there. And as they were travelling across from Persia to Iraq, the famous Polish story about that they bartered a can of bully beef for a Syrian brown bear that they found this villager carrying along the road, and this brown bear became the mascot of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, and it stayed with them throughout all their adventures through the Second World War, Wojtek, and there's various books on this Wojtek the soldier bear. But whilst they were in Iraq, they reformed along the British line. They became known as the Polish Army in the Middle East, but forever this army, whatever they would call the Polish Army in Russia, the Polish Army in the Middle East, and then their eventual name, which was the Polish Second Corps, they were forever known as Anders' army because he led them out. And they formed these three major divisions. The first was the 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division, and they were made up of that first evacuation in the April of 1942, plus, I mentioned at the beginning, a group of them had formed an independent rifle brigade that had fought in North Africa, so they were battle hardened. So they formed the 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division. Then the 2nd Infantry Division was the 5th Kresy Infantry Division, based on their homeland of the Kresy that was no longer. And then the 3rd was the 2nd Warsaw Armoured Brigade, and it was to that my father was allocated to become a driver. And by this time, Stalingrad had ended, and Stalin had lost all patience and decided that any Pole now in Russian territory was a Soviet citizen. This is my dad's driving licence from his time in the Polish Army in the East, Anders' army, in British and Polish. And as I say, it was renamed to the Polish Second Corps, but forever known as Anders' army. And then on the 13th of April 1943, just over 80 years ago, there was a shocking announcement on Radio Berlin. And what they announced was that as the Germans were advancing through Russia, they actually discovered a mass grave of Polish officers that had been shot back in the April of 1940, all with a single bullet in the back of their head. Russia immediately blamed Germany on it, and the Allies didn't dispute it. Sikorski, the president of the Polish government in exile, demanded an independent Red Cross inquiry, and Stalin just blew his top and ended all relationships with Poland. And when we talk about the crime of Katyn, we think of it as being a single event, but sadly it wasn't. Basically, in the April of 1940, I mentioned that the elite, the civilian elite, were segregated into civilian camps, and the officers into special camps, and they were all taken from these camps and sadly murdered. And there's evidence of these camps all over the place, even just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Another one that had been discovered in Ukraine, so never documented but awful. So the green ones, the civilian, and the red, the military. In the June of that year, 1943, Sikorski, here with Anders, visited the Middle East to assess their capabilities and their abilities to fight and everything. He was actually advised against touring the Middle East, but anyway, he came, and this was in the June, 80 years ago. He actually visited his army in the Middle East. He bade farewell to Anders, as you can see, in Cairo, and he set off for home in his aeroplane, stopping off at Gibraltar on the way. And when he left Gibraltar the following morning, with his daughter, several British diplomats, his plane mysteriously plummeted into the sea on takeoff.